I stepped out of the carriage and into the suffocating silence of Dustwood, my boots crunching against the gravel as the wind brushed past with an eerie, hollow sound. The town seemed reluctant to wake, its sagging rooftops and crooked chimneys casting skeletal shadows under the overcast sky. A lone sign creaked on rusty hinges above a shuttered general store, its faded lettering whispering of better days. "Elliot," I began, tightening my scarf against the chill. "I think you've finally found a place that hates visitors more than the swamps of Louisiana." Elliot Brooks, unshaken as always, glanced at me with that faint smirk of his, the one that told me he'd already assessed the place 6 ways to Sunday. His coat billowed slightly in the wind as he turned his attention to the distant silhouette of the Silverthorn Mine, its entrance yawning wide like the gaping maw of some ancient beast. "It's not the town that hates visitors, Miguel," he replied, his voice low and measured. "It's the mine." His words, though simple, sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I had long since learned to trust his instincts, even when they led us into places like this, where the air seemed to hum with unspoken warnings. The innkeeper, Mrs. Grimshaw, greeted us with a scowl when we stepped inside her establishment. If the cold outside was biting, her expression was downright frigid. She stood behind the counter, wiping a glass with a cloth that had seen better days. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, lingered on Elliot for a moment before shifting to me. "You're the detective they sent," she said, her tone more accusation than greeting. Elliot nodded, unbothered by her hostility. "Elliot Brooks. This is my colleague, Miguel Vasquez." "Colleague, how?" she muttered, squinting at me. "You look more like a schoolteacher than someone who'd poke around Silverthorn." "Well, I left the classroom behind for something livelier," I replied, forcing a smile, "though I might start reconsidering my career choices." Mrs. Grimshaw snorted but didn't press further. Instead, she handed us a key with a warning, "Keep to your rooms after dark. Dustwood ain't a place for wandering souls." "Are there any left?" Elliot asked, pocketing the key. Her gaze darkened. "Not many." The room was sparse but serviceable, its single window offering a grim view of the town square. I set my bag on the creaky bed and turned to Elliot, who was already spreading a map across the small wooden table. "All right," I said, rolling up my sleeves. "Where do we start?" Elliot tapped a finger on the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Silverthorn Mine is here, to the west. But before we head there, I want to speak with the locals. Someone here knows more than they're saying." I couldn't argue with that. Rumors about the mine were as thick as the fog that clung to this place. Stories of disappearances, ghostly voices, and shadows that moved of their own accord. I'd dismissed most of it as superstition, but the nervous glances we'd received on our way into town suggested otherwise. We found Henry Foster outside the blacksmith's shop, his grizzled face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He was sharpening an axe with slow, deliberate strokes, the screech of metal against stone filling the air. "Mr. Foster," Elliot began, stepping forward. The old man looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Depends who's asking." "Elliot Brooks. We're investigating the incidents at Silverthorn Mine." Foster set the axe down, his shoulders tensing. "Nothing to investigate. That place is cursed. Always has been." "So we've heard," I interjected. "But curses don't just happen. Someone, or something, started it." Foster's lips pressed into a thin line. "Look, I don't know what you're hoping to find, but you won't get the truth from me. Dustwoods lived with Silverthorn's shadow for too long. We don't talk about it. Why not? Elliot asked, his tone calm but probing. The old man hesitated, glancing around as if the trees themselves might be listening. Finally, he leaned in and whispered, "Talking brings it closer." The warning echoed in my mind as we approached the mine later that afternoon. The path was overgrown, the foliage closing in on either side like grasping hands. The entrance loomed ahead, framed by jagged rocks and crumbling supports. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a faint metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. "I don't like this," I muttered, gripping the strap of my satchel. "It feels wrong." Elliot didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the darkness ahead, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He paused at the threshold, raising his lantern to illuminate the passage within. The light revealed rusted tracks, scattered tools, and the faint outline of symbols carved into the stone walls. "Ritual carvings," I said, stepping closer to examine them. "These aren't just miners' marks. They're deliberate, purposeful." Elliot nodded. Someone was trying to summon, or contain, something. "Let's hope it was the latter," I said, shivering despite myself. The deeper we ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The lantern's glow seemed to shrink, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The air was thick, heavy, as if the mine itself were alive and watching. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of our footsteps. But as we pressed on, it grew louder, more distinct, a disembodied voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "Leave, while you can." I froze, my heart pounding. "Elliot, did you hear that?" "I heard it," he replied, his voice steady. "Keep moving." "Keep moving?" That's your response to ghostly warnings. Fear is its weapon, Miguel. Don't let it work. Easier said than done. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run as far from this place as possible. But Elliot was already moving ahead, his lantern cutting through the gloom. Cursing under my breath, I followed. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls lined with more carvings. In the center stood a rusted mining cart, its contents hidden beneath a layer of dust. Elliot approached it cautiously, his lantern casting long shadows. "This is where it started," he murmured, brushing the dust away to reveal a small, jagged object, a fragment of something larger. It pulsed faintly, emitting an unnatural glow. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's expression darkened. "A piece of the puzzle." Before I could respond, the cavern shook violently. A deafening roar filled the air, and the shadows around us began to twist and writhe. "Run!" Elliot shouted, grabbing my arm. We bolted back through the tunnel, the walls trembling as the mine threatened to collapse. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic cacophony that clawed at my sanity. We barely made it out before the entrance caved in behind us, a cloud of dust billowing into the sky. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, my hands trembling. "What was that?" I managed to choke out. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He stood there, staring at the ruined entrance, the relic fragment clutched tightly in his hand. "Proof," he said finally. "Proof that this isn't just a curse. It's something far worse." The air outside the collapsed mine was sharp and biting, though the chill had less to do with the weather and more with what we had just experienced. My breathing was still ragged, the acidic tang of dust and fear lingering at the back of my throat. I stood bent over, hands on my knees, staring at the rocky debris sealing the entrance. My pulse pounded in my temples like a desperate drumbeat. Elliot Brooks, in stark contrast, stood upright, his expression calm as he turned the fractured relic fragment over in his hand. How he managed to look composed after nearly being crushed under a collapsing mine was beyond my understanding, though I suppose that's why he was the renowned investigator and I was merely his frazzled companion. "Do you have any idea what just happened?" I finally asked, my voice cracking. "Yes," Elliot said simply, without looking up from the relic. I waited for him to elaborate, but Elliot had long since mastered the art of withholding information until it suited him. His silence was both infuriating and, admittedly, one of the reasons his deductions often hit harder. He let people stew in the unknown, let them dig themselves into rhetorical graves before he swooped in with the solution. But I wasn't in the mood for his games right now. "Elliot," I said, louder this time. We were nearly buried alive. Shadows were moving, voices were whispering. None of this is normal. At the very least, tell me you know what we're dealing with. Finally, he looked up, his dark eyes calm but intense. "We're dealing with greed," he said. "Greed and desperation. Someone in this town wanted power. Miguel, power that shouldn't exist. They carved those symbols, dug too deep, and invited something into this world that doesn't belong here." I rubbed my temples, trying to process his words. "And this thing they invited? You think it's tied to this relic?" Elliot gave a curt nod. "Not just tied to it, controlled by it. The carvings, the whispers, the collapsing mine, they weren't random occurrences. They were warnings." "Warnings?" I repeated, incredulous. They felt more like death threats. Elliot turned his attention back to the relic fragment, holding it up so the weak sunlight caught its faint glow. "Whatever power this relic contains, it's incomplete. A piece is missing, and until we find it, we won't understand the full extent of what we're dealing with." We returned to the inn under the weight of a dozen new questions. Mrs. Grimshaw met us at the door, her sharp eyes darting from my disheveled appearance to Elliot's calm demeanor. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes. "I warned you not to go poking around. Still alive, I see," she said dryly as she handed Elliot a cup of tea. "Most folks who cross paths with that mine don't come back." "Most folks aren't us," Elliot replied, accepting the tea with a nod. "Tell me, Mrs. Grimshaw, do you know of anyone in this town with a particular interest in folklore or rituals? Someone who might have known about the carvings in the mine?" She stiffened at his question, her eyes narrowing. "Why do you ask?" "Because those carvings weren't done by accident," Elliot said. "Someone put them there for a reason, and I need to find out who." For a moment, Mrs. Grimshaw said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the edges of her apron, and her gaze flickered toward the fireplace, where the embers glowed faintly. "There was a man," she said finally, her voice low. "Years ago, back when the mine was still operational. He was a prospector, but he had peculiar interests. Spent more time studying books and drawing symbols than digging for gold. The others started calling him the Speaker, on account of the strange things he'd say about the mine. How it was alive." Elliot leaned forward slightly, his attention sharp. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Grimshaw hesitated, then shook her head. "He vanished. One day, he went into the mine and never came out. Most folks thought it was a cave-in, but There were whispers. People said he'd gone too far, summoned something he couldn't control. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The speaker, I murmured. Do you think he's connected to the relic? Elliot didn't answer, but the intensity in his gaze was answer enough. Later that evening, as the town fell into its uneasy slumber, Elliot and I spread the map across the table in our room. The relic fragment lay beside it, its faint glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. The speaker's disappearance aligns with when the mine started gaining its reputation for being cursed, Elliot said, tapping a point on the map near the mine's entrance. If he was the one who carved those symbols, then it's possible he left behind other clues. Ritual sites, perhaps. Ritual sites. I repeated, frowning. Places where the speaker might have conducted experiments or performed rituals to harness the relic's power, Elliot explained. If we can find those sites, we might find the missing piece of the relic and the truth about what happened in that mine. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. And let me guess, these ritual sites are going to be just as dangerous as the mine itself. Elliot allowed himself a faint smile. Possibly. Fantastic, I muttered. Remind me again why I agreed to come with you on this case. You didn't, Elliot said. You insisted. He wasn't wrong, but as I stared at the glowing fragment and the ominous markings on the map, I couldn't help but wonder if my curiosity would one day be the death of me. The first site we explored was in the forest just outside of Dustwood. The map led us to a small clearing, where a crumbling stone altar stood beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient oak tree. The altar was covered in carvings similar to those we'd seen in the mine, though these seemed older, more weathered. This is it, Elliot said, kneeling beside the altar. Another piece of the puzzle. I remained a few steps back, my eyes darting around the clearing. The air here felt wrong, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. You think the missing piece is here? I asked. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He traced his fingers over the carvings, his brow furrowed in concentration. Not here, he said finally, but close. These carvings suggest this was a place of summoning, where the speaker may have first attempted to call upon the relic's power. Summoning, I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Why is it always summoning? Before Elliot could respond, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing our lantern and sending a chill down my spine. In the darkness, I heard it again, the whisper. Leave now. Elliot, I hissed, my hand tightening around the strap of my satchel. We're not alone. I know, he said, his voice calm but firm. Stay close. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as shadows began to move among the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled to relight the lantern, its flickering glow revealing twisted shapes in the darkness. Elliot, I said urgently, whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. Elliot stood, his gaze fixed on the altar. This site is connected to the relic, he said. We need to document the carvings before we leave. They might hold the key to understanding the speaker's intent. You're joking, I said, incredulous. The shadows are moving, Elliot. We need to go. But Elliot didn't move. He knelt once more beside the altar, his pencil moving swiftly across the pages of his notebook as the whispers grew louder and the shadows crept closer. Trust me, Miguel, he said. This is important. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting between the encroaching darkness and Elliot's focused expression. Trust him, I always did. But in that moment, as the forest seemed to close in around us, I wondered if trust would be enough to save us. The clearing wasn't silent anymore. Not truly. Though the wind barely rustled the leaves above, the atmosphere hummed with tension. It was as if the forest itself had begun to breathe, exhaling faint whispers between the gnarled branches. I tightened my grip on the lantern, willing its flickering glow to hold steady against the encroaching shadows. Elliot was crouched beside the altar, his pencil scratching feverishly across the pages of his notebook. "Why am I always the one watching for threats while you write things down?" I muttered, glancing back at the shifting shapes among the trees. "This is starting to feel like a very lopsided partnership." "Because you're good at it," Elliot replied without looking up, his tone maddeningly calm. I wanted to argue, to remind him that I hadn't signed up to play lookout for ghosts, or whatever these things were, but the words caught in my throat. The truth was, I wasn't just good at it. I had a knack for sensing when something wasn't quite right. And right now, everything about this clearing screamed *wrong. The carvings on the altar seemed to pulse faintly, their spiraling patterns glowing with the same unnatural energy as the relic fragment. Though Elliot insisted on studying them, I couldn't shake the feeling that the carvings were watching us, waiting for the right moment to act. "Are you done yet?" I hissed, taking a step closer to him. "Because I don't think the locals are planning to roll out a welcome mat anytime soon." Elliot didn't respond immediately, his focus unbroken as he sketched a particularly intricate symbol. Finally, he straightened and tucked the notebook into his coat. "I've got what we need," he said. "Let's go." The path back to the inn felt longer than it should have, the forest closing in around us like a hungry predator. The shadows among the trees were slower now, hesitant, as if sensing our departure. But the whispers followed us, faint and fragmented, carried on the wind like the lingering echo of a nightmare. Elliot walked ahead, the lantern swaying at his side, while I trailed behind, my gaze darting nervously to every flicker of movement in the darkness. Though we had left the clearing, the oppressive weight of its presence hung over us, pressing against my chest with every step. "What do you think they were trying to summon?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. "The speaker, I mean. Those carvings, they weren't just decoration." Elliot slowed his pace but didn't turn around. "Power," he said simply. "People like the speaker always want power, and they're willing to risk everything to get it." "But what kind of power?" I pressed. "Enough to curse an entire town? Enough to keep those things alive?" Elliot hesitated for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder. In the dim light, his expression was unreadable. "Enough to destroy everything, if we let it." Back at the inn, Mrs. Grimshaw met us with the same wary expression she always wore, her sharp gaze flickering to the dirt-stained edges of Elliot's coat. Though she said nothing, I could tell she was already adding our names to the long list of outsiders Dustwood had claimed. "Your room's upstairs," she said curtly, her tone leaving little room for conversation. "If you need anything, don't bother asking." "Your hospitality is unmatched, as always," I said dryly, earning myself a glare that could have frozen the sun. Elliot, true to form, ignored the exchange entirely and headed for the stairs. I followed, though the weight of the relic fragment in my satchel felt heavier with each step. Once inside our room, I dropped the bag onto the bed and sank into the rickety chair by the window. "I don't like this," I said, watching Elliot spread the notebook across the table. "The carvings, the whispers, the shadows. It's like the forest itself wants us gone." Not the forest, Elliot corrected, flipping to a fresh page. The curse. The speaker designed it to protect the relic. Anyone who gets too close becomes a threat. Fantastic, I muttered. So now we're not just investigating a curse. We're fighting it. Elliot didn't respond immediately, his pencil moving swiftly as he began piecing together the symbols from the clearing. Though his expression was calm, the tension in his movements told me more than his words ever could. He was worried. And Elliot Brooks was rarely worried. The relic fragment rested on the table between us, its faint glow casting eerie shadows across the walls. I couldn't stop staring at it, though every instinct told me to look away. There was something unnatural about the way it pulsed, as if it were alive, or trying to be. You think there's more of it out there? I asked finally, breaking the silence. Elliot nodded without looking up. The carvings suggest the relic was fractured during the speaker's last ritual. If we find the missing pieces, we might be able to understand what went wrong and how to fix it. Fix it? I repeated, incredulous. Elliot, this isn't a broken clock. It's a cursed object that nearly got us killed. What makes you think it can even be fixed? Elliot paused, setting the pencil down. For the first time since we left the clearing, his gaze met mine. Because we don't have a choice, he said simply. If we don't fix it, the curse will never stop. The second sight on the map led us deeper into the forest than I would have liked, the path twisting and narrowing until the trees pressed in on either side. Though the sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy above, the shadows felt darker here, thicker, as if they were waiting for us. Elliot walked ahead, the map folded in his hand, while I trailed behind, my lantern barely holding back the encroaching gloom. I wanted to say something, to break the oppressive silence, but my throat felt dry, and my thoughts were too tangled to untangle. Finally, the path opened into another clearing. This one was smaller than the first, its center dominated by a ring of standing stones arranged in a spiral. Though the carvings here were less intricate, they pulsed with the same faint glow, their patterns radiating outward like ripples in a pond. Another summoning site, Elliot said, stepping into the center of the spiral. I stayed at the edge, my grip tightening on the lantern. Tell me we're not going to trigger anything this time. Elliot ignored my comment, his attention fixed on the stones. These carvings are connected to the relic, he said. The speaker didn't just create a curse. He created a network, a way to amplify its power. And now it's amplifying something else, I muttered. Something that wants us gone. Elliot began sketching the stones, his pencil scratching across the pages of his notebook, while I kept watch for movement among the trees. Though the clearing seemed calm at first glance, the air felt heavier than it had at the first sight, charged, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then the whisper came again. Leave, while you can. Elliot, I said urgently, my eyes darting to the shadows. It's happening again. I know, he said, his voice steady. Stay close. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as the shadows began to move among the trees. My grip tightened on the lantern, its flickering light revealing twisted shapes in the darkness. Elliot, I said, my voice rising. Whatever you're going to do it fast. I'm almost done, he replied, his pencil moving swiftly. Almost done. That phrase was as much a curse as the one we were investigating. But as I watched Elliot work, his focus unbroken despite the chaos around us, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For better or worse, I trusted him, even if it meant walking straight into the unknown. The morning broke gray and sullen, as if the sun itself had lost its way over Dustwood. The air had a damp, earthy quality, carrying the scent of wet stone and decay. I leaned against the inn's windowsill, staring out at the town square below. It was eerily lifeless, as though the events of the previous night had drained what little vitality this place still held. Elliot sat at the small table behind me, his usual calm demeanor unshaken as he pored over the symbols he'd sketched from the altar. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "most people would take collapsing tunnels and ominous whispers as a sign to leave. Find a safer profession. Maybe open a bakery. And yet, you're still here," he replied, not looking up. His pencil moved with steady precision, tracing and retracing the intricate patterns etched in his notebook. I turned away from the window, crossing my arms. "I'm here to make sure you don't get yourself killed. Someone's got to write your memoirs when this all goes south." Elliot paused for a moment, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, before returning to his work. The map would piece together from the mine, and the clearing pointed to a third site, farther from town. It was marked with a symbol that looked like an eye, its pupil split by a jagged line. Elliot suspected it would hold another piece of the puzzle, but I had my doubts. The closer we got to unraveling the speaker's secrets, the more it felt like something, or someone, was trying to stop us. We set out just after sunrise, following a narrow trail that wound through the dense forest. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The shadows were deep and unsettling, their edges shifting as though alive. Every now and then, the wind would pick up, carrying with it the faintest hint of a whisper, just barely audible above the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice low. "Hear what?" Elliot's reply was calm, almost indifferent, but I could see the way his eyes scanned the trees. "Whispers," I said. "Same as before, like the forest is watching us." Elliot didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his coat, his gaze fixed ahead. "It's not the forest, Miguel. It's the curse. Fear is part of its design." "Wonderful," I muttered. "So now we're dealing with a sentient curse. Just what I needed to start my day." The third site came into view just as the path began to slope downward. It was a small clearing, dominated by a ring of monolithic stones arranged in a circle. The ground was covered in moss and scattered with dead leaves, but the stones themselves were pristine, their surfaces etched with more of the speaker's symbols. At the center of the circle lay a shallow pit, its edges lined with blackened stone. Whatever ritual had been performed here, it hadn't been for anyone's benefit. "This is it," Elliot said, stepping into the circle. "The speaker's influence is strong here." I stayed at the edge, my eyes darting to the trees. Strong enough to try and kill us, no doubt. Elliot knelt by the pit, his fingers brushing over the charred stones. This wasn't just a ritual site. It was an anchor. The speaker used it to stabilize the curse's energy, to keep it tethered to this place. "Which begs the question," I said, taking a cautious step closer. "Why would someone go to such lengths? What's the point of cursing a mine in the middle of nowhere?" Elliot didn't look up. Power, Miguel. The same reason behind every act of desperation. As Elliot began documenting the site, I kept watch, my lantern casting faint circles of light that seemed to stretch forever before dissolving into the shadows. The air was thick here, heavier than it had been at the first two sites. Every breath felt like an effort, every sound amplified to a deafening degree. The symbols on the stones began to glow faintly, their lines pulsating with an unnatural energy. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Elliot, the rocks are lighting up. Is that supposed to happen? Elliot looked up, his expression unchanged. It's the relic, he said. Its presence is reactivating the site. Reactivating, I repeated, my voice rising. That doesn't sound good. It's not necessarily bad, he replied, turning back to his notebook. It means we're close to understanding how it works. I didn't find that particularly reassuring. The hum started a few minutes later, low and almost imperceptible at first, but steadily growing louder. It seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, a deep, vibrating sound that resonated in my chest. The glowing symbols began to shift, their lines rearranging into new patterns that seemed to defy logic. Elliot, I said, my voice trembling. Something's happening. I know, he said, his pencil still moving. Stay focused. Stay focused. I shouted. We're standing in the middle of a cursed site that's lighting up like a Christmas tree, and you want me to stay focused. Before Elliot could respond, the hum reached a crescendo, and a blinding light shot upward from the pit. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as the clearing was bathed in an otherworldly glow. Shadows danced wildly along the trees, their shapes stretching and contorting into grotesque forms. And then the whisper returned, louder and clearer than ever. Leave this place. The voice was layered, overlapping itself in a chorus of anger and despair. It wasn't just a warning, it was a command. The stones began to tremble, their glowing patterns pulsing faster and faster as the light intensified. Elliot, we need to go. I shouted, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. Elliot stood, his notebook clutched tightly in one hand, the relic fragment in the other. He stared at the pit, his expression unreadable. Not yet, he said. We're close. Close to what? Getting killed. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward the pit, holding the relic fragment out in front of him. The light seemed to respond, bending toward the fragment like a moth to a flame. The hum shifted in pitch, becoming a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Come on, Elliot. I shouted. This isn't worth it. But he didn't move. The shadows surged forward, their shapes coalescing into a single, towering figure. Its form was indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the clearing with a suffocating dread. It loomed over Elliot, its glowing eyes locked onto the relic fragment. Return. What is ours? The voice was a thunderclap, shaking the ground beneath our feet. I froze, my lantern slipping from my grasp and shattering on the ground. Elliot, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, his gaze meeting mine for the briefest moment. In that instant, I saw something I'd never seen in him before, fear. Run, he said. We bolted from the clearing, the light and shadows crashing behind us like a wave. The forest seemed alive, its branches clawing at us as we ran. The ground shook beneath our feet, the hum now a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. I didn't stop until we broke through the tree line, collapsing onto the dirt path. My chest heaved, my heart racing as I glanced back at the glowing clearing. The light was fading, the hum growing quieter until it was nothing but a distant echo. Elliot was beside me, his face pale, the relic fragment still clutched in his hand. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned to me, his expression grim. "The speaker isn't just a memory," he said. "They're still here, watching." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, staring at the cursed forest that seemed to stretch endlessly before us. Elliot was quieter than usual, which didn't bode well. I'd spent enough time in his company to recognize that silence meant one of two things. Either he was deep in thought, piecing together fragments of the puzzle with his meticulous mind, or he was preparing for the next step in a plan he hadn't fully explained to me yet. I wasn't sure which option was worse. The remnants of our encounter at the third site still clung to me like smoke. The shadows, the hum, the overwhelming presence that had loomed over us. It felt as though the forest itself had reached into my chest and squeezed. Dustwood's long shadow had begun to seep under my skin, and though Elliot seemed unaffected on the surface, I could feel the tension radiating from him as we studied the map spread across the inn's table. "This one," Elliot said finally, tapping a point on the map with the edge of his pencil. "The fourth site. It's closer to the mine, which means it's likely more significant." Significant as in useful, or significant as in deadly? I asked, leaning back in my chair. Elliot glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Probably both." "Of course," I muttered. "Why make anything easy?" We left the inn shortly after dawn, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Dustwood was still as lifeless as ever, its streets deserted save for a lone dog sniffing around the base of a lamppost. Mrs. Grimshaw watched us from the doorway as we passed, her sharp eyes following our every step. She didn't say anything, but her expression carried a weight I couldn't quite place. A warning, perhaps, or simply resignation. The forest was quieter than it had been the day before, though the silence wasn't comforting. It pressed against my ears, amplifying every crunch of leaves underfoot, every rustle of branches overhead. The trail to the fourth site was narrow and uneven, forcing us to move single file through the dense undergrowth. "You know," I said, breaking the oppressive quiet, "when I signed up for this, I thought I'd be assisting with ordinary investigations. Missing persons, stolen heirlooms, things that didn't involve curses and sentient shadows." Elliot didn't look back as he replied, "The ordinary cases don't need solving. It's the extraordinary ones that matter." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" I asked, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "If it makes you feel better, you're welcome to turn back," he said. I rolled my eyes, though he couldn't see it. "You know as well as I do that turning back isn't an option anymore." The fourth site was different from the others. The clearing was larger, the trees surrounding it gnarled and twisted as if in pain. At its center stood a massive stone slab, its surface covered in carvings that seemed to ripple in the dim light filtering through the canopy above. Unlike the previous sites, the energy here wasn't subtle. It was palpable, radiating from the slab in waves that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Elliot approached the slab without hesitation, his lantern swaying at his side. I stayed back, my instincts screaming at me to keep my distance. There was something about this place that felt more alive than the others, as though the very ground beneath us was watching, waiting. "These symbols are more intricate," Elliot said, running his fingers over the carvings. "They are lead. The speaker's influence is strongest here." "Strong enough to kill us, probably," I muttered, gripping the strap of my satchel. "Do me a favor, Elliot. Try not to trigger anything this time." "Noted," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't making any promises. As Elliot began documenting the slab, I kept my focus on the perimeter, my eyes darting to every flicker of movement in the shadows. The energy in the clearing seemed to shift as Elliot worked, the symbols on the slab glowing faintly with each stroke of his pencil. The hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground and up into my chest. "Elliot," I said, my voice tight, "it's happening again." "I know," he replied, his tone steady. "Stay focused." "You keep saying that," I snapped. "But it's hard to focus when the forest is trying to eat us." He didn't respond. His pencil continued moving, the notebook filling with sketches and notes that seemed to pull the symbols from the slab onto the page. I took a step closer to him, the hum growing louder with every beat of my heart. Then the whisper came, louder than before. "Leave, now." The voice wasn't just in my ears. It was in my head, twisting through my thoughts like a serpent. The shadows around the clearing surged forward, their shapes coalescing into a single, towering figure. I froze, my lantern trembling in my grip as the figure loomed over us, its glowing eyes locked onto the slab. "Elliot," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go." "Not yet," he said, his gaze fixed on the slab. I wanted to grab him, drag him away from the clearing, but my feet refused to move. The shadows pressed closer, their presence suffocating, until I could barely breathe. The figure raised an arm, the shadows writhing around it like smoke. "Return. What is ours?" Elliot straightened, his notebook clutched tightly in one hand, the relic fragment in the other. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm as he spoke. "You created this curse. You can end it. Tell me how." The figure didn't answer. Instead, it surged forward, its glowing eyes narrowing as the shadows spiraled outward, engulfing the slab in darkness. The clearing erupted in chaos. The hum became a deafening roar, the ground trembling beneath our feet as the shadows lashed out, tearing through the air like claws. I stumbled back, my lantern shattering against the ground, its light extinguished in an instant. "Elliot!" I shouted, my voice lost in the cacophony. He didn't move. The relic fragment in his hand pulsed with energy, its glow cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into fragments that swirled around the slab like a hurricane. I forced myself to my feet, my instincts screaming at me to run. But I couldn't leave Elliot. Not now, not ever. I staggered toward him, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the slab. "Come on," I shouted. "We're not dying here." We stumbled out of the clearing, the shadows crashing behind us like a wave. The forest seemed alive, its branches clawing at us as we ran. The hum faded into the distance, replaced by the pounding of my heart and the sound of our ragged breathing. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the dirt path. The clearing was gone, its glow extinguished, but the weight of its presence remained heavy in my chest. Elliot sat beside me, his face pale, the relic fragment still clutched in his hand. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned to me, his voice low but steady. "The speaker isn't just a memory," he said. "They are still here, watching." I swallowed hard, the chill of his words settling into my bones. "So what do we do now?" Elliot's gaze shifted to the horizon, his expression grim. "We find the truth, whatever it takes." The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not the ordinary quiet of morning, but something sharper, deeper, an absence of sound that gnawed at the edges of the air. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move through Dustwood, as if the very fabric of the town had begun to unravel. I stared out the window of our room at the inn, my gaze fixed on the horizon where the forest loomed like a gathering storm. Behind me, Elliot was methodically packing his satchel. His movements were precise, deliberate, as though each item had a specific place and purpose. It was a ritual I'd seen countless times before, but today it felt heavier somehow, weighted by the events of the past few days. "We're heading back to the mine, aren't we?" I asked, not turning from the window. "We don't have a choice," Elliot replied. The fourth site was important, but everything points back to Silverthorn. That's where it began, and that's where it has to end. I let out a slow breath, watching as the fog clung stubbornly to the distant trees. "You know, I've been meaning to ask, what's the plan when we find whatever's waiting for us down there? Because I'm starting to think documenting carvings isn't going to cut it." Elliot didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was as calm as ever, but there was an edge to it, a faint tremor I almost missed. "We adapt," he said, "just like we always do." The path to the mine was eerily familiar, each step stirring a memory I'd rather leave buried. The crumbling supports, the jagged rocks framing the entrance, the faint metallic tang in the air. It all felt like a doorway to something that should have stayed sealed. I tightened my grip on the lantern, its fragile light casting flickering shadows on the uneven ground. "You've got that look again," I said, glancing at Elliot as he adjusted his coat. "The one that says you're 3 steps ahead and already regretting it." Elliot allowed himself a faint smile. "Maybe I am." "Great," I muttered. Nothing like regret to boost morale. The entrance yawned before us, its darkness swallowing the weak morning light. For a moment, I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But then Elliot stepped forward, his lantern held high, and I followed. Because I always did. The air inside the mine was colder than I remembered, each breath forming a thin mist that hung in the stale air. The walls were damp, streaked with minerals that glistened faintly in the lantern's glow. The carvings were still there, their jagged lines weaving through the stone like veins of a long-dead creature. "Do you ever think about how old this place is?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How much history it holds? All the lives that passed through here before." I trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Before the curse," Elliot said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Before greed turned this place into a tomb." I couldn't argue with that. We pressed deeper into the mine, the path sloping downward as the walls seemed to close in around us. The carvings became more intricate, their patterns twisting and overlapping in ways that made my head ache if I looked at them for too long. There was a rhythm to them, a strange, pulsing energy that I could feel in my chest. "These markings," Elliot said, stopping to study a particularly dense cluster. "They're changing, evolving." "That's not reassuring," I said, glancing over my shoulder at the encroaching darkness. "You know that, right? It means the curse is responding to us," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "The relic's presence is disrupting it, forcing it to adapt." Again, not reassuring. Elliot turned to me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Fear is part of the curse's design, Miguel. It wants you to run, to give up. Don't let it win." I wanted to tell him that it already felt like it was winning, but I held my tongue. Instead, I nodded and adjusted the lantern, its flickering light suddenly feeling far too small. The tunnel opened into a cavern I recognized immediately. This was where it had begun, the place where we'd found the first relic fragment, where the mine had tried to bury us alive. The air was heavier here, laden with the weight of the past. The carvings on the walls seemed brighter, their glow casting eerie patterns across the uneven floor. Elliot knelt by the spot where the fragment had been, his fingers brushing over the stone as if searching for something. I hung back, my gaze scanning the cavern for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed thicker here, their edges sharper, and the hum that had haunted us at the previous sites was louder, vibrating through the very bones of the mine. "It's still here," Elliot said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What's still here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The speaker's influence," he replied, standing. "It's stronger here than anywhere else. This is the heart of the curse." As if on cue, the hum intensified, becoming a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The carvings pulsed in time with the sound, their glow shifting from a pale blue to a deep, angry red. The shadows along the edges of the cavern began to move, coalescing into shapes that were almost human. "Elliot," I said, taking a step back, "we've got company." "I see it," he said, his tone calm. "Stay close." The shadows surged forward, their forms flickering and shifting like smoke caught in a storm. Their eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with the same red light as the carvings, and their voices, a chorus of whispers and screams, filled the cavern. "You do not belong. Leave while you can." I tightened my grip on the lantern, its light barely holding the shadows at bay. "Elliot, I really think we should listen to them this time." "We're not leaving," he said, stepping forward. The relic fragment in his hand pulsed with energy, its glow cutting through the darkness like a blade. "Not until we finish this." What happened next was almost too fast to process. The shadows lunged, their forms stretching and twisting as they closed the distance between us. Elliot raised the fragment, its light flaring brilliantly as the shadows recoiled, their screams filling the cavern. "Keep them back," Elliot shouted, his voice commanding. "I need time." "Time for what?" I yelled, swinging the lantern at a particularly aggressive shadow. The light seemed to weaken it, causing it to dissipate into wisps of smoke, but more kept coming, their forms endless and relentless. Elliot didn't answer. He was focused on the carvings, his notebook forgotten as he traced their lines with his free hand. The relic fragment pulsed in his grasp, its glow syncing with the patterns on the walls. "Hurry up, Elliot," I shouted, my back against the wall. The shadows were pressing in, their forms growing more solid with each passing moment. My breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the curse pressing down on me like a tidal wave. "Almost there," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "Hold on." And then, just as I thought the shadows would overwhelm us, the cavern was filled with a blinding light. The carvings flared brilliantly, their patterns dissolving into streams of energy that flowed toward the relic fragment. The shadows screamed as the light engulfed them, their forms breaking apart and fading into nothingness. When the light finally dimmed, the cavern was silent. The carvings were gone, their glow extinguished, and the oppressive weight of the curse had lifted. I collapsed to the ground, my heart pounding, my limbs trembling. Elliot stood in the center of the cavern, the relic fragment glowing faintly in his hand. He turned to me, his expression grim but triumphant. "It's not over," he said, "but we've taken the first step." I wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but I was too exhausted to speak. Instead, I nodded, the realization settling over me like a heavy fog. Whatever lay ahead, we were far from finished. The room at the inn was thick with tension. The relic fragment rested on the table between us, its dull glow casting an otherworldly light across Elliot's notes. I couldn't look at it for too long. The faint pulsing of its light, steady, rhythmic, made my stomach churn. Or maybe it wasn't the light. Maybe it was knowing that this thing, this shard of a curse, had brought us closer to the edge of destruction than I'd ever dared to tread. Elliot sat across from me, his brow furrowed as he pored over the notebook. He was muttering to himself, piecing together fragments of symbols, meanings, and theories while I sat back, watching the shadows shift on the walls. "You ever think," I began, breaking the silence, "that maybe there's no fixing this? That some things are just broken for a reason?" Elliot didn't look up. "If you're trying to convince me to stop, Miguel, it's not going to work." "I'm not saying we stop," I replied, leaning forward, my elbows resting on the edge of the table. "I'm saying we don't even know what we're dealing with. We've got fragments of a relic, carvings that don't make sense, and a curse that seems to want us dead. Maybe we're in over our heads." Elliot finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting mine. "If we are, then that's all the more reason to keep going. This curse, it's not just affecting the mine. It's spreading. Dustwood is just the beginning." The weight of his words settled over me like a lead blanket. I wanted to argue, to push back, but I knew he was right. He always was. It was nearly midnight when we returned to the mine. The forest was unnaturally still, the air heavy with the kind of silence that made every step feel deafening. The lantern in my hand flickered as we approached the entrance, the faint light barely penetrating the dense shadows that loomed ahead. Elliot led the way, his steps deliberate and steady. I followed close behind, my eyes darting to every flicker of movement in the darkness. The mine's gaping entrance loomed before us, a black void that seemed to swallow the dim moonlight. "You think the speaker's still down there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't pause. "We're about to find out." The air inside the mine was colder than I remembered, each breath forming a thin mist that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. The walls were damp, streaked with mineral deposits that shimmered faintly in the lantern's glow. The carvings were everywhere now, their jagged lines weaving through the stone like veins. We moved deeper, the path sloping downward until the air grew so thick it felt like I was breathing through a wet cloth. The hum was faint at first, a barely audible vibration that seemed to resonate in my bones. But as we descended, it grew louder, more insistent, until it was the only sound I could hear. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Elliot nodded, his gaze fixed on the tunnel ahead. "We're close." The tunnel opened into a cavern unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls glowed faintly, their surfaces covered in spiraling carvings that seemed to shift and move as I looked at them. In the center of the cavern stood a massive stone altar, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed in time with the hum. Elliot approached the altar without hesitation, his lantern casting long shadows that stretched across the cavern floor. I hung back, my instincts screaming at me to keep my distance. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice steady. "The heart of the curse." "You sure about that?" I asked, taking a cautious step closer. "Because it looks more like the mouth of something that wants to eat us." Elliot ignored me, setting the relic fragment on the altar. The pulsing light intensified, the carvings on the walls glowing brighter as the hum reached a deafening pitch. The air felt electric, charged with energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And then, the whisper returned. "You do not belong." The shadows in the cavern began to move, coalescing into shapes that flickered at the edges of my vision. They weren't fully formed, but they were there, watching, waiting. "Elliot," I said, my voice tight. "We've got company." "I see them," he replied, his gaze fixed on the relic. "Stay calm. Stay calm." I hissed. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're staring at." Elliot didn't respond. He was focused on the relic, his fingers tracing the symbols on the altar as the light grew brighter. The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in. "Return. What is ours?" The voice growled, low and guttural. Elliot straightened, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face the shadows. "The relic doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice firm. "It belongs to the people who suffered because of you. And I'm going to end this." The shadows roared, their forms stretching toward him like tendrils of smoke. I swung the lantern at one of them, the light causing it to recoil with a shriek. "Elliot!" I shouted. "Whatever you're going to do it now." Elliot placed his hands on the relic, his lips moving in a whisper I couldn't hear. The light flared, the symbols on the altar glowing with a brilliance that filled the cavern. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into wisps of darkness that were pulled toward the light. The cavern shook, the ground beneath us trembling as the energy reached a crescendo. The shadows were gone, but the light continued to grow, its intensity blinding. I shielded my eyes, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the hum reached a pitch so high it felt like it would split my skull. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the hum disappeared, and the cavern was silent. Elliot stood over the altar, the relic fragment in his hands. Its glow had dimmed, but the energy it held was still palpable. "What just happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "I disrupted the curse," he said, turning to face me. "But it's not gone. Not yet. Not yet." I repeated, incredulous. "What more do we have to do? We've faced shadows, whispers, collapsing tunnels. What else is there?" Elliot's gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. "The speaker. This isn't over until we stop them." The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we'd done enough, that we should leave before the mine claimed us for good. But I knew Elliot. I knew he wouldn't stop, not until he'd uncovered the truth. And, as much as I hated to admit it, I couldn't leave him to face it alone. We left the cavern in silence, the relic fragment tucked safely in Elliot's satchel. The path back to the surface felt longer, darker, and though the shadows no longer moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we finally stepped out into the night, the cool air hit me like a wave. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. "Do you ever get tired of being right?" I asked, glancing at Elliot. He gave me a faint smile, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes." I shook my head, a nervous laugh escaping my lips. "Well, here's hoping you're wrong about one thing, that this isn't the end." Elliot didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said it all. The mine's darkness wasn't just physical. It was alive, curling around us with deliberate intent. It had a weight, a presence that pressed against my chest with every cautious step deeper into its depths. My lantern barely held the shadows at bay, its flickering glow revealing more of the jagged carvings that snaked along the damp walls. The silence was broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath our boots and the faint hum that pulsed through the stone, a reminder that the curse wasn't dormant. Elliot, as always, walked ahead, his movements precise and steady. It wasn't fearlessness. I knew him too well for that. It was determination, the kind that ignored fear and pushed forward regardless of the cost. He held the relic in one hand, its faint pulsing glow merging with the rhythm of the carvings. I stayed close, my knuckles white around the lantern's handle. "This place feels worse than last time," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Like it knows we're here." "It does," Elliot said, his tone calm as he studied the patterns on the walls. "The closer we get to the source, the stronger its influence becomes." "Fantastic," I muttered, just when I thought things couldn't get worse. Elliot didn't respond, his focus shifting to a particularly intricate carving that glowed brighter as we passed it. He stopped, tracing the pattern with his free hand, his brow furrowed in thought. "This one's different," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It's layered, almost like it's trying to hide something." "Or warn us," I suggested, glancing nervously at the shadows pressing against the edge of the lantern's light. "Whatever's down here doesn't seem interested in welcoming us." We pressed on, the tunnel sloping downward until the air grew colder, thicker, as though the mine itself was holding its breath. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the walls and into my bones. It wasn't just sound, it was energy, palpable and suffocating. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls glowing faintly with the pulsing rhythm of the carvings. At the center stood a stone archway, its surface etched with spirals and symbols that seemed to twist and writhe as I looked at them. The air around it shimmered, charged with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Elliot approached the archway without hesitation, his lantern casting long shadows that stretched across the cavern floor. I stayed back, my instincts screaming at me to keep my distance. "You think this is it?" I asked, my voice tight. Elliot nodded, his eyes fixed on the archway. "This is the gateway, the speaker's final connection to the curse." "Connection," I repeated, incredulous. "It looks more like the entrance to something we don't want to find." Elliot ignored my comment, setting the relic on the ground before stepping closer to the archway. The carvings pulsed brighter, their glow matching the rhythm of the relic. The air grew heavier, charged with energy that made my breath catch. And then, the whisper returned. "You cannot stop this." The shadows in the cavern surged forward, their forms coalescing into figures that flickered at the edges of my vision. They weren't fully solid, more smoke than substance, but their presence was undeniable. They moved deliberately, circling the archway as though drawn to its power. "Elliot," I said, backing away, "we've got company." "I see them," he replied, his tone steady. "Stay close." The figures grew clearer as they circled us, their glowing eyes locked onto the archway. Their whispers overlapped, a cacophony of anger and despair that filled the cavern. "Return, what is ours?" Elliot raised the relic, its pulsing light flaring brighter as the figures recoiled. The carvings on the archway shifted, their patterns rearranging into new shapes that glowed with a brilliant intensity. "They are bound to the gateway," Elliot said, his voice rising above the noise. "If we can sever the connection, we can weaken the curse." "And how exactly do we do that?" I shouted, swinging the lantern at a particularly aggressive shadow. The light caused it to retreat, but more surged forward, their forms relentless. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to the archway, the relic glowing brighter with every step. The energy in the cavern was overwhelming now, the hum vibrating through my chest like a thunderclap. Elliot! I shouted. Whatever you're doing, do it fast. Elliot placed the relic into a carved indentation on the archway, its glow syncing with the patterns on the stone. The energy surged, the carvings flaring brilliantly as the figures screamed, their forms dissolving into wisps of shadow. The cavern shook violently, the ground trembling as the hum reached a deafening pitch. The light from the archway intensified, its brilliance swallowing the cavern in a wave of blinding radiance. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as the shadows disappeared, their screams fading into silence. When the light dimmed, the cavern was still. The archway's glow was gone, its carvings dark and lifeless. The energy in the air had dissipated, leaving behind an eerie calm. Elliot stood over the archway, the relic dim in his hand. He turned to me, his expression grim but resolute. "The connection is severed," he said, "but the speaker isn't gone." The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to argue, to say that we'd done enough, that it was time to leave this cursed place behind. But I knew Elliot. I knew he wouldn't stop, not until he'd uncovered the truth. "Then what's the next step?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear twisting in my gut. Elliot's gaze shifted to the tunnel ahead, his eyes dark with determination. "We find the speaker, and we end this." The path back to the surface felt longer, darker, and though the cavern was silent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. Elliot walked ahead, his lantern casting faint light on the damp walls, while I trailed behind, my thoughts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. When we finally stepped out into the night, the cool air hit me like a wave. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. The mine's shadow loomed behind us, a constant reminder of the curse we had yet to defeat. "You ever wonder why it's always us?" I asked, glancing at Elliot. He gave me a faint smile, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Because no one else is willing." "Well," I said, laughing nervously, "here's hoping that changes someday." Elliot didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said it all. This wasn't over. Not yet. The mine loomed before us, its jagged entrance swallowing the last rays of sunlight as the day faded into night. The air was heavy with anticipation, each breath carrying the weight of the unknown. I gripped the lantern tightly, its fragile light barely holding back the encroaching darkness. Beside me, Elliot stood steady, his gaze fixed on the tunnel ahead. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice betraying the anxiety I couldn't shake. "You've got that look again. The one that says we're walking into something we won't come back from." Elliot didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the strap of his satchel, the relic fragment glowing faintly at his side. "If we don't end this now," he said finally, "it'll never stop. The speaker won't let it." I swallowed hard, the chill of his words settling into my bones. I wanted to argue, to suggest we turn back and leave this cursed place behind, but I knew it would be pointless. Elliot had made up his mind, and, as much as I hated to admit it, so had I. The tunnel stretched endlessly before us, the walls slick with moisture that shimmered faintly in the lantern's glow. The carvings were everywhere now, their lines twisting and overlapping like a tangled web. They pulsed with energy, the rhythm syncing with the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. "We're getting close," Elliot said, his voice low. "The speaker's influence is strongest here." "Close to what?" I muttered, my eyes darting to the shifting shadows at the edges of the light. "Because it feels like we're walking straight into the lion's den." Elliot didn't respond. He was focused, his movements precise as he traced the patterns on the walls with his fingers. The relic pulsed brighter in his hand, its energy resonating with the carvings as we descended deeper into the mine. The tunnel opened into a cavern unlike any we'd seen before. It was massive, its walls glowing with the same pulsating energy that had followed us throughout the mine. At its center stood a stone dais, its surface etched with spiraling carvings that seemed to shift and twist as I looked at them. The air was thick, charged with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Elliot approached the dais without hesitation, his lantern casting long shadows that stretched across the cavern floor. I hung back, my instincts screaming at me to keep my distance. There was something wrong about this place, something alive. "This is it," Elliot said, placing the relic on the dais. "The heart of the curse." "You sure about that?" I asked, my voice tight, because it looks more like the trap door to the underworld. Elliot ignored my comment, his focus shifting to the carvings on the dais. The relic pulsed brighter, its energy syncing with the patterns as the hum in the cavern intensified. And then, the whisper returned. "You cannot stop this." The shadows in the cavern surged forward, their forms coalescing into a single, towering figure. It wasn't just smoke this time. It was solid, its shape twisting and writhing as it stepped closer. Its eyes burned with a brilliant red light, and its voice echoed through the cavern, a chorus of anger and despair. "You dare defy me." Elliot stood firm, the relic pulsing in his hand as he turned to face the figure. "Your curse has caused enough suffering," he said, his voice steady. "It ends tonight." The figure roared, its shadows stretching toward him like tendrils of smoke. The carvings on the dais flared brightly, their glow sinking with the relic as the air in the cavern grew heavier, suffocating. "Elliot!" I shouted, swinging the lantern at the encroaching shadows. The light caused them to recoil, but they didn't retreat. "Whatever you're going to do it now." Elliot placed the relic into a carved indentation on the dais, its glow flaring brilliantly as the carvings shifted, their patterns dissolving into streams of energy that flowed toward the figure. The shadows screamed, their forms breaking apart as the energy engulfed them. The cavern shook violently, the ground trembling as the hum reached a deafening pitch. The light from the dais intensified, its brilliance swallowing the cavern in a wave of blinding radiance. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as the energy surged, consuming everything in its path. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the hum disappeared, and the cavern was silent. The dais was dark, its carvings lifeless, and the shadows were gone. The weight of the curse had lifted, leaving behind an eerie calm. Elliot stood over the dais, the relic dim in his hand. He turned to me, his expression grim but resolute. "It's done," he said. "You sure?" I asked, my voice hoarse, "because I'm not looking forward to round 2. Elliot nodded, his gaze shifting to the tunnel ahead. "The speaker is gone. The mine is free." As we stepped out into the night, the cool air hit me like a wave. The forest was quiet now, its oppressive silence replaced by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Dustwood's shadow had lifted, and though the town still bore the scars of the curse, it was finally free. I turned to Elliot, a nervous laugh escaping my lips. Do you ever get tired of being right? He gave me a faint smile, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Sometimes. Asterisk asterisk ending scene asterisk asterisk. The camera lingers on the mine's entrance, its jagged edges silhouetted against the rising sun. The light spills across the forest, illuminating the town in the distance. But as the camera pans downward, it reveals the remnants of the curse. A faint shimmer in the air, a whisper carried on the wind. Asterisk, you cannot erase what was done. Asterisk. The screen fades to black as the final whisper echoes softly.